A flight attendant acted aggressively toward a black CEO, but he calmly stepped aside, turning the situation around in a way that left the entire cabin stunned. He tried to knee the black CEO in the stomach, thinking a quick strike would go unnoticed. He didn't realize the man he targeted had reflexes and authority that couldn't be challenged. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets instant consequences. The flight attendant's footsteps were uneven. Darian Vellon noticed it the moment the cartwheels clicked into position beside row 3. He hadn't asked for anything yet, hadn't spoken more than a quiet good morning since boarding AltairJet Flight 937, but the sound struck him. 1 foot heavier than the other. The left, he guessed. A subtle limp, perhaps, or impatience. He didn't turn around. Not yet. Instead, he finished reviewing the technical blueprint on his tablet, the presentation that would finalize the Northwell partnership. A partnership that could put Arison's new adaptive learning platforms into the hands of students across the entire public district. Years of groundwork depended on this trip, and Darian didn't believe in distractions. Still, something in the energy behind him refused to stay silent. Faint breath, a shadow lingering just a second too long in the overhead bin reflection. Darian's seatback wasn't reclined. He hadn't made any special requests, but the attendant, tall, square-jawed, with thinning blonde hair, stood just behind him, fussing with the same bin for a third time. Darian blinked. The man didn't move. Then, with mechanical cheer, the attendant snapped the bin closed and muttered, "All secure," though nothing had changed. He turned briskly and walked down the aisle, pausing 2 rows behind to hand water to a trio of passengers with practiced, professional ease. Darian remained still. His fingers hovered over the tablet, scrolling through annotated slides. He didn't need the water, but the message had been sent. Seconds later, the same man passed by again, eyes flicking toward Darian's face without stopping. The name tag read Corvin, no surname. Darian's instincts twitched, not fear, but calculation. Something about Corvin's gaze felt too pointed, too ready. He'd seen looks like that before. Not from rivals across a boardroom, but from men who needed someone to absorb blame for their own failures. Men who mistook calm for challenge. He adjusted his sleeve, brushing a small speck of lint from the navy blazer. First class wasn't full, and most passengers were still buckling in. The engine hum deepened as the plane taxied. Corvin moved toward the front again, passing another crew member. This one younger, dark-haired, carrying a clipboard. Darian caught only a whisper in the exchange, but the younger man's expression shifted from nervous politeness to visible discomfort. "Performance issues," someone behind Darian muttered to his seatmate. "He's the one from that delay last month." Darian didn't turn around. Gossip wasn't his concern, nor did he feed it. But now the variables had shifted. He discreetly locked his tablet and glanced toward the aisle. A reflection shimmered again in the window's edge. Corvin, this time watching from the galley door, half obscured, pretending not to look. But the angle of his jaw betrayed otherwise. The plane lifted. Darian leaned back, jaw relaxed, mind already in the boardroom across state lines. He had rehearsed the data, modeled the long-term projections, and knew how to present to educational policymakers with confidence, not pressure. But another part of his mind, the part trained not in business but in observation, kept track of Corvin's pacing. Each step, each glance, each skipped row of service. Eventually, the beverage cart rolled again. Water for 3A, juice for 3C, nothing for 3B. Darian. Corvin didn't pause, didn't ask. Darian looked up, not in confrontation, but acknowledgement. He gave a single polite nod, saying nothing. Corvin looked past him, literally past him, then moved on. The younger attendant, trailing a few rows behind, seemed to notice. His gaze lingered as if debating whether to intervene. But protocol and perhaps fear kept him silent. He made a note on the clipboard, something Darian caught only in peripheral vision. The seatbelt light dimmed. Darian exhaled slowly. Still, he didn't speak. He knew better than to escalate too early. The stakes were too high for ego, and yet silence didn't equal surrender. In the lull that followed, Corvin returned, this time empty-handed, this time slower. He stopped behind Darien once more. "You need something, sir?" he asked, tone deceptively level. "Warm water, if it's no trouble," Darien replied, voice even. Corvin's jaw ticked. "Only have cold," he said, though Darien had just watched a carafe of steam trail from the galley tray a moment earlier. "Unless you want to wait." "I can wait," Darien said. Corvin's lips twitched, almost a sneer, but he nodded curtly and stepped away. Something about the exchange hadn't been about water. Darien knew that. It was a probe, a temperature check, and his refusal to react had just unsettled Corvin further. He glanced to the reflection again. The galley was darker now, shadowed, but Corvin stood there gripping the counter's edge. His mouth moved slightly, muttering. The younger attendant, Darien hadn't caught his name, walked by once more, holding a stack of inventory slips. He paused near Darien's row, just long enough to whisper, "He's not supposed to be flying today," before hurrying on. Darien's fingers curled slightly on the armrest. He knew what came next. He had seen it before in hostile meetings, in high-stakes acquisitions where egos bled into bad decisions. This wasn't about service. It was about perception. Somewhere, somehow, Corvin had decided Darien represented something that needed correction. Or punishment. Whatever grudge Corvin carried had been lit by proximity and misread silence. And the flight had only just begun. The captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing cruising altitude and clear skies ahead. Darien kept his eyes on the reflection, watching Corvin move, no longer with the rhythm of duty, but of purpose. He wasn't fixing bins anymore. He was orbiting, waiting. The cabin did not yet know that one quiet decision would soon change everything. Corvin Hale approached with a forced smile stretched too tightly across his face, pushing the beverage cart forward as if daring it to veer off course. "Warm water, was it?" he asked, his tone clipped like the edge of a snapped wire. Darien Velen, seated calmly in his first-class seat, nodded once with the same steady composure that had earned him respect in boardrooms across the country. "Yes, thank you," Darien replied, voice even. Corvin gave a curt nod, poured slowly, and then, whether by accident or design, his hand jerked just slightly. A few droplets of water splashed onto Darien's sleeve. "Oops," Corvin said under his breath, a mockery of apology barely audible. "Clumsy me." Darien looked at the sleeve, then back up at Corvin. "No harm," he said, gently dabbing the drops with a napkin. His voice betrayed no offense, but something in Corvin's face darkened. He didn't move for a second, standing just a little too close, fingers still tight on the cart. From the galley nearby, the young trainee attendant, Varen, watched with unease. His gaze flicked down to Corvin's hand gripping the cart handle, knuckles pale, tendons tense. And then, under his breath, Corvin muttered something Varen could just barely hear. "Entitled types." Varen blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. He glanced to Darien, who had already returned to reviewing documents on his tablet. The moment was quiet, but heavy, like the seconds before a fault line gives way. The cart rolled on. The passengers behind Darien received their drinks with smiles and polite exchanges. But when Corvin returned again, he paused near Darien's seat with a suspicious frown. "You're blocking the aisle," he said, loudly enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. Darien looked up, confused. "I'm fully within my seat," he said calmly, gesturing to the clear path between him and the aisle. Corvin leaned in slightly, still holding the cart. "I need space to work," he snapped. From the rows behind, phones discreetly rose, passengers sensing the tension, unsure what they were witnessing but instinctively feeling its weight. The air changed, subtly but unmistakably. "I assure you, I haven't moved outside the designated space," Darien said, keeping his voice measured. Corvin's lip twitched. "That's so?" He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for no one but Darien. "You think politeness hides challenge? I've dealt with men like you before. I won't be pushed around today." Darien studied his face. There was no pretense anymore. The civility was gone, replaced by something brewing beneath the surface, resentment that seemed older than this flight, older than today. Before Darian could respond, the captain's voice came cheerfully over the intercom. "Shout out to our wonderful crew up front for smooth service today. Appreciate you all." The timing hit like a cruel joke. Darian blinked once and turned back to his screen. But the atmosphere had thickened. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some kept their phones low, recording quietly. Others avoided looking up at all. Corvin took one step back. His jaw tensed. His eyes, however, did not leave Darian. Something had shifted in him, a resolve not to de-escalate but to escalate, to regain control of whatever power he thought was slipping away. Varen, now closer to the scene, watched the veteran attendant with alarm. He had been trained to notice pre-conflict indicators, posture tightening, prolonged focus, irrational targeting. And Corvin was displaying all of them. In a small motion, almost imperceptible, Varen gave Darian a look, a mix of warning and apology. He couldn't speak, but the glance said everything. "Be ready." Darian nodded faintly in return. His breathing stayed even. His hands never left the armrests. He understood. Panic would do nothing. Pride would do worse. He'd been here before, not on a plane, but in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations where tension walked the line between professional and personal. This wasn't about water, or space, or aisle protocol. It was about something deeper Corvin was carrying. Something Darian had triggered by simply existing in a seat that perhaps Corvin believed wasn't meant for him. Corvin turned sharply on his heel, his steps stiff and fast as he returned to the galley. But he didn't disappear. He hovered behind the curtain, not working, not assisting, watching, waiting. Varen edged closer to the galley wall, pretending to check supplies. From there, he could see Corvin staring, breath steady but eyes full of something unspoken. The seconds dragged. Then Corvin muttered, barely audible, "He thinks he's better." The words slipped out like venom, like something long rehearsed. Varen's heart pounded. He didn't know what Corvin planned, but he knew what was coming next wasn't routine. It wouldn't be accidental, and it wouldn't be a mistake. It would be an attack. The next move would not be a mistake. It would be an attack. The stack of napkins hit the floor like a soft explosion, fluttering across the narrow carpeted aisle beneath the overhead lights. A tremor of turbulence had rocked the aircraft moments earlier, minor, unremarkable, but it was enough to knock the bundled serviettes from Corvin Hale's unsteady grip as he stood beside seat 3A. They scattered at Darian Vellen's feet like pale feathers, white against the dark blue carpet. "You really need to stop causing distractions," Corvin snapped, his voice sharp and far louder than necessary. Passengers turned at the sound. A few startled gasps broke the quiet. Darian blinked slowly, registering the words, then glanced down at the napkins near his shoes. The comment made no sense, but he recognized its intent. This wasn't about spilled napkins. It was about provocation. "I can help pick those up," Darian said evenly, already leaning forward in his seat with a calmness that masked the weight of his thoughts. His fingers reached for a few of the fluttered sheets. His expression didn't change, steady, professional, and without ego. But Corvin flinched, as if the gesture were an insult. His eyes narrowed in a way that didn't match the moment. To any outsider, the image might seem innocuous, an attendant and a passenger mid-cleanup. But to Varen, the young trainee watching from the galley's corner, the shift in Corvin's stance was a red flag. It was a posture he'd been trained to watch for in simulation drills. Feet planted too wide, jaw clenched, a slight lean forward. It wasn't service posture. It was a combat trigger. Something's about to go wrong. Darian felt it too. Even before Corvin's next move, he noted the cold calculation in the man's gaze, the way he wasn't looking at the napkins but at Darian's face. Darian's instincts, honed in high-stakes negotiations and crisis rooms, clicked into place. His mind began to track spatial awareness. The location of the beverage cart behind him, the distance to the aisle wall, the shifting glances of passengers growing more alert. Corvin's shoes squeaked slightly as he stepped forward, too close, well into Darian's personal space. You think hiding attitude behind politeness makes it better? Corvin muttered through clenched teeth. His voice was just above a whisper, meant only for Darian to hear, but the tension in his tone was like a rope pulled too tight. I think being polite is the least we owe each other, Darian replied, low and steady, not backing down, not engaging either. Then Corvin moved. He reached out suddenly, gripping the top of Darian's seat back and yanking it forward with more force than necessary. You're not complying with upright safety position, he said loudly, tone full of false authority. I'm correcting it. The seat didn't budge much. Darian had already anticipated something like this. His right hand came up, not to strike, not to threaten, but to stop. Calmly, firmly, he placed it on Corvin's forearm, halting the motion. The gesture was clear. Don't escalate. But Corvin's eyes flashed with something worse than anger. It was humiliation. Behind them, passengers began recording, not in panic, but with that modern sense of vigilance. A woman diagonally across the aisle tilted her phone just enough to capture the angle. Another leaned slightly, pretending to fix her headset while her camera app remained open. A middle-aged man across row 4 froze in place, eyes wide, reading the subtext. The captain's voice echoed from the intercom overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now entered stable cruising altitude. Please enjoy your flight. The words might have comforted the rest of the cabin, but to Darian, they fell like bricks. Stability in the air. Instability in row 3. Corvin jerked his arm free, breathing hard. His pupils were dilated, his fingers twitching near his side. Darian didn't move, his posture was neutral, but his mind was calculating. Not reacting meant control. Control meant safety. In the background, Varen leaned toward another crew member near the galley door. His voice was nearly inaudible under the hum of engines. I think he's about to cross it. Cross what? The line, Varen whispered. The one we're trained never to. Corvin's eyes darted to the beverage cart, then to Darian, then back to the cart again. Darian noticed. He shifted his legs slowly under the tray table, creating just enough space to maneuver if needed. His briefcase had already been secured under the seat in front of him. Nothing blocked his feet. No tray was down to hinder a reaction. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Corvin turned without a word and took a few rigid steps toward the cart. Passengers whispered now, no longer sure if they were watching a service error or something deeper. One man leaned toward his wife. This is not normal, he murmured. Varen moved halfway down the aisle, not intervening, but placing himself between Corvin and the rest of the cabin. His eyes locked with Darian's. It was a subtle warning, but it was there. Darian nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He understood. Each breath stretched. Each second ticked. Behind his calm gaze, Darian's mind ran probabilities. What this man might do. What angle the cart presented. How much distance he'd need to respond. How to protect passengers if something sudden erupted. His job wasn't just to stay safe now. It was to hold the line, to be the steady center in an unraveling storm. Corvin's hand hovered above the cart handle. The lights in the cabin flickered once as the aircraft shifted slightly in the sky. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, silence. Thick, fragile, alive with unspoken tension. No one imagined the next step would be a physical strike. The cart rattled violently as Corvin Hale shoved it forward, his footsteps pounding down the aisle with manic determination. He moved like a man under orders, sharp, direct, fueled not by duty, but by something darker. With a sudden halt, he positioned himself mere inches from Darian Vellen's seat, face flushed, jaw clenched, eyes burning with accusation. You've been tampering with the seat controls, he said coldly, his voice slicing through the low murmur of the cabin. Darian blinked once. That's not true, he replied evenly, his voice low but firm. His posture remained composed, yet every muscle was alert beneath the surface. Several passengers looked up, alarmed by the tension. A few tried to interject. He didn't do anything, said a man 2 rows behind, but Corvin threw up a hand with theatrical authority. Stay seated. This is a crew matter, he barked, silencing them with false confidence. At that exact moment, the captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing, "Crew, secure for light turbulence." Unaware that Corvin had already become the source of the real disturbance, the timing gave Corvin cover. He leaned in closer, too close, his breath ragged and aggressive. Darian's eyes narrowed slightly. He could feel the shift in energy. This wasn't an outburst. It was a calculated escalation. And then it happened. Without warning, Corvin lunged forward, driving his knee upward with vicious speed, aiming for Darian's stomach. The motion was abrupt, forceful, and terrifying. But Darian had seen it coming. In a motion refined by years of crisis preparedness and honed instinct, he pivoted just enough to the side. The knee struck only air. Corvin's weight carried him forward uncontrollably. His knee, expecting resistance, met none. Off balance, momentum betrayed him. Darian's left hand moved, not with aggression, but with control, guiding Corvin's arm just enough to redirect him. It was a motion of defense, not domination. Corvin slammed sideways into the beverage cart with a loud, jarring crash. The entire cart lurched back violently, metal trays clanging, containers toppling. It slammed into the galley wall with a metallic boom that echoed through the stunned cabin. Gasps erupted across the aisle. Passengers froze, their shock mingling with the growing realization that this was no misunderstanding. This was an attack. And Darian had just dodged it without throwing a single punch. Varen, the trainee attendant, dashed from the galley, wide-eyed. "Corvin, stop!" he shouted, his voice high with panic, arms raised in disbelief. But Corvin, now on the floor, tried to scramble upright again. His face twisted with fury and something else, something unstable. Darian stood calmly, not advancing, not retreating, just watching, prepared. As Corvin rose, he muttered something under his breath, disjointed, chilling. Orders? Compliance behavior. He's not following it. Darian caught the words, his mind locking onto them. They weren't part of any standard crew vocabulary. Not even close. Varen's face paled. He looked at Darian, then back at Corvin, as if confirming that he too had heard it. That muttering wasn't from stress. It was from something scripted, something deeper. The passengers were no longer just witnesses. They were participants in an unraveling truth. "Corvin," Varen said again, softer now, almost pleading. "You need to stop. This isn't what we're trained to do." Corvin didn't answer. He stood, shaking slightly, eyes darting, not at Darian now, but at something only he could see in his head. His lips moved silently, as if rehearsing a protocol no one else knew existed. A boy in row 4 began to cry. A father placed his hand gently over the boy's shoulder, eyes never leaving the scene. Darian slowly stepped back into his seat space, not out of fear, but to allow visibility. He knew the importance of being seen, witnessed, understood. This wasn't just about surviving the moment. It was about ensuring the moment left no confusion in its wake. Phones were recording. Heads were turning. The tension had transformed. What started as an accusation became an assault. What began as irritation exploded into revelation. And still, Corvin twitched with unresolved intent, his breathing heavy, face slick with sweat. His eyes flicked to the cart, to the ceiling, to Darian's unmoved stance. He seemed both lost and desperate, like a man trying to recall lines from a play that no longer made sense. Then came the silence, not of peace, but of unraveling. The truth, half-spoken, hung in the air like turbulence itself. And just as the captain instructed passengers to remain calm for minor air pressure shifts, a far greater shift was occurring, one that would rip through the airline far beyond the flight path. The first strike had been dodged, but it had left something bigger exposed. The strike meant for Darian had instead shattered the silence of the entire aircraft. The beverage cart shuddered violently as it struck the side wall of the galley, wheels spinning to a halt, and for a moment the entire cabin held its breath. Corvin Hale stood hunched over it, one hand bracing himself while the other clutched the cart's edge like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His face, red and drawn with fury, twitched as he straightened his posture. Behind him, murmurs rippled through the rows of passengers, words like unbelievable, he just attacked him, and is this real? Floated in the air like static. Without warning, Corvin spun around. He attacked me, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Darian Velen. Darian didn't move. His posture was relaxed, hands open and visible, his calm expression an unsettling contrast to Corvin's unraveling state. Across the cabin, phones were lifted higher, screens glowing like quiet witnesses. The moment Corvin's accusation left his lips, those silent lenses became his undoing. No, we saw everything. One passenger near row 4 called out. We got it all on video. Corvin's eyes darted to the raised phones and faltered. His voice cracked slightly as he stammered. He tried to interfere with crew duties. A man across the aisle interrupted. You tried to knee him. We saw it. For Darian, the objective had shifted. This was no longer about self-defense. It was now about containment, protecting not just himself, but every innocent person trapped in this tense cabin with an unstable man in uniform. He took one step forward, slowly, deliberately. Let's keep everyone safe, he said firmly, scanning the aisle and ensuring his tone invited reason, not fear. But Corvin had crossed some internal line, and there was no pulling him back. He surged forward again with a guttural yell, aiming to shove past Darian with the beverage cart. But this time, Varen was faster. The young trainee attendant stepped in from the side, arms outstretched. Corvin, stop! 2 passengers joined him without hesitation. A businessman with sleeves rolled up and a college-aged man in a hoodie braced themselves beside Varen, forming a physical barrier between Corvin and Darian. Get out of the way! Corvin shouted, his voice fraying at the edges. You need to calm down, said the man in the hoodie. You're scaring people. Corvin ignored him. I have protocol authority. The cockpit will listen to me. He tried to barrel forward, but the makeshift barrier held. Foreshadowing emerged like a blade through cloth as Darian's gaze narrowed. Something silver gleamed faintly beneath Corvin's apron. A clipped device, metallic, unfamiliar. It didn't resemble a radio, safety tool, or anything standard issue. Darian took note. Every detail now mattered. The captain's voice broke through the overhead speaker. We are currently evaluating the possibility of a priority landing due to in-flight crew complications. Please remain calm and seated. The words crew complications were a sterile understatement for what had already unfolded. Corvin snapped his head toward the intercom. No. He can't divert. He doesn't have authority to, he muttered. But this time his voice dropped into something eerily detached, almost like he was speaking to someone invisible. Orders are still being tested. This is part of the phase. Darian took one slow step back, gesturing discreetly to the passengers nearest the aisle. Keep recording, he whispered. No matter what happens. The businessman nodded and steadied his phone. Corvin tried again, pushing forward with blind force. He reached for the beverage cart and shoved it down the aisle like a battering ram. Gasps erupted. The cart rolled with terrifying speed toward Darian. But Darian was ready. He pivoted just enough, placing his right hand on the side of the cart as it came toward him. With trained precision, he absorbed the momentum and redirected it, not into passengers, not into chaos, but into controlled stillness. The cart bounced slightly off his guiding pressure and came to a stop against the seat wall without striking anyone. The passengers broke into whispers of shock and awe. Corvin stumbled forward with the motion, caught in his own failed assault, and then staggered back. His face now wore something stranger than rage, confusion, doubt. Varen stepped forward again, voice trembling. He shouldn't be here. He was under review for behavioral instability. They said it was under control, but I knew it wasn't. Darian turned to him, calm but alert. Why wasn't this reported? They told us not to raise it formally. They said they'd handle it quietly. The cabin was no longer a place of transit. It had become a courtroom in motion. every second presenting new evidence, every silence carrying weight. Darian's leadership was no longer just admirable. It was essential. Then Corvin slumped against the wall, panting. His gaze flicked toward the apron again, toward that clipped device, as though he remembered it was still there. Darian noted the look, the twitch, the calculation. Something bigger was at play. Everyone on board now understood that this was no misunderstanding. It was a crisis waiting to explode. Chaos exploded the moment Corvin Hale stumbled back from the beverage cart crash, his chest heaving as he steadied himself against the galley wall. The once orderly cabin now buzzed with confusion and dread. Varen's voice, shaky but urgent, crackled through the cabin intercom line as he radioed the cockpit. "This is Varen, we have a crew-initiated safety breach. Repeat, a crew-initiated safety breach." Silence followed on the channel. The weight of that phrase, so rarely uttered, hung in the air like smoke. Corvin's eyes darted across the cabin, wild and unfocused. His uniform was rumpled. His jaw clenched so tightly his neck trembled. "He attacked me," he barked, pointing at Darian, his voice shrill with desperation. "He tried to grab my arm." Several passengers shouted back in protest. Phones were already recording, screens glowing like shields. One man in row 4 raised his hand and said firmly, "We have it on video. That's not what happened." Darian Velen, still standing between the seated passengers and the increasingly unstable flight attendant, didn't flinch. His voice was calm and level. "Let's all stay seated. Keep your phones up. No sudden moves. We're almost through this." Corvin's nostrils flared. He took a step forward, but Varen intercepted him, planting himself directly in Corvin's path. "Stop, Corvin. Please. You need to sit down," he said, his voice cracking. Corvin's shoulders tensed, and his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You don't get to command me. You're not cleared." Then he turned, locking eyes with Darian. He's the one violating compliance. He didn't follow the instruction sequence. Darian narrowed his eyes. "You never gave any instructions." Corvin's breathing grew ragged, and something in his demeanor shifted, like a thread inside had snapped. Darian noticed it instantly. His instincts, honed through years of high-stakes negotiations and risk assessments, went on high alert. This wasn't merely insubordination or arrogance. It was delusion wrapped in authority. Two other male attendants at the rear exchanged nervous glances. Darian caught it. They knew something. The cabin jolted slightly with turbulence. Nothing serious, but enough to deepen the collective unease. The captain's voice finally returned over the speakers, tense and clipped. "We're diverting to Westford Terminal for emergency review. Passengers, remain seated. Flight crew, prepare for controlled descent." Corvin's reaction was immediate and irrational. "No, that's not authorized. We haven't completed the behavioral sweep." He shoved past Varen, lunging toward the front of the cabin. Two passengers, one in business attire, the other in a hoodie, stood simultaneously, grabbing Corvin by the arms. The attendant thrashed wildly, nearly knocking them over. Darian moved fast, stepping in without hesitation. He wrapped one arm behind Corvin's shoulder and used his other to redirect the man's momentum, forcing him gently but firmly back toward the galley wall. Corvin grunted in resistance, but Darian applied just enough pressure to stop the struggle without causing injury. His movements were clean, practiced, controlled leverage over brute force. "Don't escalate this," Darian said quietly near Corvin's ear, his tone unwavering. "You'll only make it worse." Corvin struggled again, red-faced and breathless. "Restraints," Varen yelled, pulling a kit from the emergency locker. "We have to restrain him now." Corvin twisted sharply. "Restraints are for subjects, not me. I'm not the test." Darian's brow furrowed. That word, subject, not passenger, not individual, subject, sent a chill through him. Corvin wasn't seeing reality. He was operating from a script, one written by someone else. The two passengers helped hold Corvin long enough for Varen to loop a restraint around his wrist. But Corvin's resistance didn't lessen. He kept muttering fragments, He wasn't compliant. The threshold wasn't met. Override failed. Darien turned to Varen. Has he ever spoken like this before? Varen hesitated, lips trembling. Not like this, but he always talked about something called compliance conditioning. Said it was part of our duty. I thought it was just a weird training phrase. Corvin bucked against the straps. They're watching. You're all being assessed. Darien glanced back at the cabin. Every face was pale, eyes wide, phones still raised. Behind them, the sky beyond the windows was beginning to shift from blue to haze as the plane descended toward Westford. Darien looked at Corvin, really looked. His eyes weren't just frantic, they were frightened. Not of arrest, not of punishment, but of something else. Exposure. What program? Darien asked softly. What are you afraid of? Corvin looked up at him, sweat dripping from his brow. It was never just training, he whispered. You're not supposed to know. Darien stepped back slowly, heart pounding, not from fear, but from realization. Whatever had been happening on this flight went far beyond personal misconduct. There was a script behind the madness, and someone else had written it. The cabin had become more than a place of conflict. It was now a stage where hidden agendas were unraveling in real time. Passengers held their breath as the captain announced their final approach. But no one, not Darien, not Varen, not the terrified crew, understood the full scale of what was about to unfold. The danger was no longer just Corvin's actions. It was the reason behind them. Corvin lunged again. The cabin lights had just flickered to emergency mode, bathing everything in a harsh, stuttering glow that made every shadow feel sharper, every movement more dangerous. Passengers gasped and clutched armrests. The sharp buzz of the intercom faded, leaving behind only the rising roar of descent and the chaos unfolding in row 3. Stay back, Varen yelled, locking both arms around Corvin's upper chest as the deranged flight attendant thrashed violently. 2 male passengers, one in a blazer, the other in a blue tracksuit, flanked Varen, gripping Corvin's arms with growing panic. But Corvin's strength was unnatural now. Desperation had turned his limbs into wires of steel. You're failing the compliance threshold. Corvin howled, spit flying from his mouth, eyes wild and unblinking. The words froze the air around them. They weren't just bizarre, they were clinical, rehearsed, like someone following a script that no one else had read. Darien's eyes narrowed. He took a single step forward, positioning himself between Corvin and the frightened passengers packed into the next row. His suit was slightly wrinkled from earlier conflict, but his stance remained calm, alert but unshaken. Laren, the boy seated across the aisle, stared at him with silent trust, his knees pulled to his chest. Darien extended a hand gently, palm down, signaling him to stay low. The plane jolted slightly as it adjusted altitude. Corvin used the moment to twist hard, breaking the grip of one of the passengers. Varen shouted, "He's trying to reach." Too late. Corvin's hand darted toward the beverage cart, fingers closing around the metal coffee flask nestled near the edge. But Darien was faster. He stepped in, sweeping Corvin's wrist downward with precise control, not force. The flask clattered harmlessly onto the floor. The passengers erupted in nervous gasps as Corvin stumbled backward, his balance broken once again by the very man he'd targeted. Darien didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He simply reset his footing, calm as ever, standing between Corvin and the aisle with the quiet strength of someone who had long since trained to respond, not react. Behind him, a nervous young man whispered, "How's he doing this?" Another responded, "He's done this before. Look at how he moves." Varen, panting, managed to slip a restraint around Corvin's left wrist. It clicked into place, drawing a sharp intake of breath from the struggling attendant. But Corvin didn't scream in pain, he kept muttering. He rerouted the program. It's not compliant anymore. The thresholds were set. He wasn't supposed to. Darien's brow furrowed. "What program?" he asked sharply, leaning just close enough to make eye contact without exposing himself to a sudden headbutt or kick. But Corvin didn't answer. His lips kept moving, but the words were buried now, hidden behind a wall of something deeper than rage. Delusion. Indoctrination. Darian couldn't tell yet. He scanned the aisle behind him. Most passengers remained seated, some clutching armrests, others still recording silently. But every eye in the cabin was on him. "Everyone stay calm," Darian said firmly, turning to the crowd. "Keep your phones recording. No one moves unless I say." Varen glanced up from the restraint. His hands trembled. He said he was trained in compliance regulation, but I've never seen any manual like that. He said I wasn't cleared to ask questions. Darian felt a chill crawl across the back of his neck. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice, calm but strained, echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for emergency descent. We've received a report of internal disruption. Ground security teams will meet us upon landing. Please remain seated and await instruction." Corvin froze. His head jerked up like a soldier hearing a code word. For the first time since the incident began, his eyes widened, not with fury, but with fear. "They're waiting," he whispered. No, that can't be. Not now. They'll find out." He turned toward the cockpit, but Darian blocked the view, his posture firm and ready. "What will they find out?" Darian asked, voice calm but loaded with weight. Corvin shook his head violently. "It was supposed to stay internal. The subjects wouldn't remember. He said it wouldn't leave the cabin." "He?" Darian pressed. "Who's he?" But Corvin wasn't listening anymore. His lips trembled, repeating the same fractured sentence. He wasn't supposed to reroute the program. Wasn't supposed to reroute. Darian turned to Varen. "What does that mean? Do you know anything about this program?" Varen hesitated, swallowing hard. There were rumors months ago about a behavioral assessment initiative, an in-house trial. Nothing ever official. They said it got shut down before it even launched. Darian's instincts snapped into place. He looked down at Corvin, not as an aggressor now, but as someone caught in a larger system. A pawn. And somewhere in the shadows of this flight, the player still remained. The lights flickered again as the aircraft dropped altitude. Oxygen masks didn't fall, but the sense of gravity thickened. Somewhere up front, landing gear groaned into position. Time was closing in. Darian adjusted his posture, keeping one eye on Corvin's bound arm and the other on the passengers behind him. They needed to know someone was still in control. "No one will be hurt," he declared clearly. "As long as we all stay alert, watch everything. If you see something strange, record it. And do not panic." The tension didn't vanish, but it had a new center. Not chaos, not fear, but focus. Corvin slumped slightly against the galley wall, his breathing ragged, eyes darting to the cockpit again, then slowly toward row 12. Darian didn't notice the shift yet. Not fully. That part hadn't begun. But something deep inside him understood. The real threat had not been the man restrained before him. Not yet. The captain's voice came one last time as the wheels touched down. "Ground security is waiting. Remain seated." Corvin closed his eyes. Darian did not blink. Whatever Corvin was hiding was far worse than a simple misconduct case. He lunged, confident in his attack, unaware that every move had been anticipated, and the next second would leave him airborne. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always collapses when faced with skill and strategy, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, jolting the cabin into a tense silence as the descent began. At that very moment, Corvin Hale, sweat lining his brow and wrists partially restrained, sat upright, eyes darting toward the front of the plane. Then, without warning, he began reciting something under his breath. At first, it sounded like gibberish, but Darian Velen recognized the rhythm. Steps, commands, triggers. This was no nervous rambling. It was protocol, rehearsed, taught, memorized, and it wasn't part of any commercial airline manual. Across the aisle, Varen, still pale, his hands trembling, leaned in close to Darian, voice barely above a whisper. "He once said something weird. that he got private instruction after hours. Said his real supervisor didn't wear a badge anymore. Darian's jaw tightened. That detail changed everything. Corvin wasn't just unstable. He had been groomed, conditioned, maybe even experimented on. That phrase again, compliance protocol. It wasn't random. It was planted. Corvin suddenly twisted his wrist against the restraint in a brutal attempt to free himself, gritting his teeth through the pain. The restraint creaked, nearly giving way. Darian moved swiftly, gripping Corvin's arm and using precise leverage to stabilize him, redirecting the strain, not amplifying it. "You're hurting yourself," he said evenly. But Corvin wasn't listening. His eyes were now locked on something behind Darian, row 12. Darian followed his gaze. There, seated alone, was a man in a dark jacket, posture perfectly still. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but something about him radiated control. Cold, quiet control. And then Darian saw the pattern. Whenever the man looked away, Corvin grew bolder, angrier. But when the man's eyes settled on him, Corvin flinched, like a student fearing judgment. Darian's stomach sank. Who was he? The plane trembled again, preparing for landing. The captain's voice echoed through the cabin, instructing everyone to brace. Darian steadied himself with one hand against the seat in front of him. The descent wasn't just physical, it was psychological now, diving toward a truth buried beneath surface procedures. Corvin buckled violently again, shrieking, "The landing exposes the program. We're not cleared. You don't understand. This isn't how it's supposed to end." Varen rushed forward to help as Darian and two passengers secured Corvin fully, strapping him down with improvised restraints. Corvin thrashed, then collapsed into a stillness filled with panting breaths and haunted eyes. For a moment, it seemed like the chaos had passed. And then the man in row 12 stood up. Darian's instincts ignited. The plane was still descending, yet the man rose with eerie calm, steadying himself as though turbulence meant nothing to him. He opened his jacket briefly, not wide enough to be obvious, but just enough for Darian to see a glint. A small silver tag, clipped near the inside lining. Not a badge, not a credential, something else. Then the man sat back down. It was calculated. A test. A signal. Darian didn't blink. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were exchanged. But the message was clear. Corvin was not the disease. He was the symptom. Corvin began weeping silently, staring at the man in terror. "He said no one would ever find us." He murmured to no one in particular. "He said if it ever came to light, we'd be deleted like bad code." The final seconds before touchdown stretched impossibly long. Passengers tightened their belts, unaware that the real threat wasn't turbulence. It was sitting calmly among them, rehearsed, composed, and entirely unafraid. The captain's voice returned, still unaware. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on final approach. Thank you for your cooperation." Darian didn't move. His thoughts sharpened like glass. He no longer needed confirmation. This wasn't over. This hadn't even begun. The man in row 12 had revealed himself. Not with violence, not with commands, but with silence. The true puppeteer had just revealed himself without a word. The wheels slammed onto the runway with a brutal bounce, gripping the tarmac in a screech that rattled the cabin walls. Passengers jolted in their seats, gasping, clutching armrests and each other. A few let out relieved sighs, believing the ordeal was finally over. But Darian Velen didn't blink. His eyes were fixed, unwavering, on the man in seat 12C, and the trembling figure of Corvin Hale, who had now shifted from attacker to something far more unstable, the frightened subject of a larger game. Emergency lights flickered outside the windows, painting the cabin with strobes of red and white. Ground teams had encircled the aircraft like silent sentinels, waiting for clearance to board. The captain's voice came overhead, calm but oblivious. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Response teams will enter shortly once protocol clearance is confirmed. We thank you for your cooperation." Darian didn't move. That single announcement, meant to calm, had instead cracked open a narrow window of vulnerability, an interval when trained responders were paused outside, and the real threat still had time to act. In Seat 3A, Corvin's entire body quivered. He no longer looked like the aggressive flight attendant who'd tried to knee Darien in the gut. His face was pale, his fingers clutching his armrest like he was holding back a scream. Slowly, his lips parted, and in a whisper barely audible over the hum of the slowing engines, he muttered, "He was never supposed to follow us here." Darien turned his head sharply. "Who?" he asked, voice low, measured. But Corvin's eyes were locked forward, fixated on row 12. He said nothing more, just that one sentence, over and over, like a frightened chant. "He was never supposed to follow us here." Darien's gaze followed his. The man in 12C hadn't flinched. He was calm, too calm. He sat upright, shoulders square, legs uncrossed, like someone waiting for a timer to go off. His eyes scanned the rows ahead without urgency, his fingers adjusting something beneath his coat in a manner too practiced to be nervous. The movement was small, nearly imperceptible, but Darien caught it. Varen appeared beside him, breath quick. "Mr. Velen," he whispered. I think that might be Drent Morik." Darien's brow furrowed. "Who?" Varen leaned closer, voice trembling. "Corvin's former supervisor. He vanished months ago. People said he was running trials, unauthorized ones, training attendants off the books, behavior testing. He was obsessed with compliance thresholds. That man, he matches his description." Before Darien could reply, the man in 12C did something no passenger should ever do during final rollout. He stood, only halfway, but it was enough. Passengers gasped. Flight rules forbade it. Seatbelts were still locked. The plane was still coasting to its gate. But the man didn't care. He adjusted his coat, raised his head, and spoke in a smooth, even tone. "I need to exit this aircraft before the evaluation is compromised." His voice was cold, controlled. There was no panic, no concern, only detachment, as if everything happening was part of a scheduled test. Darien stepped into the aisle instinctively, positioning himself between the man and the front of the aircraft. His heart beat steady, but his muscles were taut beneath his tailored jacket. "You're not going anywhere," Darien said, calm but firm. "Sit down." The man's gaze narrowed, but he didn't respond with anger. Instead, he looked amused, like a teacher confronting an unexpected student. "You misunderstand," he said. "I operate above standard authority." Darien didn't move. The man sighed and took a step forward. In that motion, Darien saw it again, a metallic glint beneath the coat. Not a weapon. Smaller, sleek, something with ports and tiny lights. His instincts kicked in. "What is that?" he demanded, pointing. "Show me your hands. Now." The man didn't flinch. "You wouldn't understand what it is," he replied, brushing his coat aside further. "But suffice it to say, the emergency landing complicates years of refinement." A stir moved through the cabin like wind through tall grass. The tension was no longer confined to the first few rows. Everyone now felt it. A few passengers gasped. One father clutched his young son to his chest. Another man whispered to his seatmate, "What is this?" Behind Darien, Corvin suddenly cried out, "Stop him! Don't let him near the cockpit. He carries the override." Time froze. The declaration rang through the cabin like an electric shock. Several passengers screamed. 2 attendants instinctively stepped back. The captain's voice did not return, likely waiting for the clearance that was now far too late. The man's face changed, not in panic, but in irritation. His hand dipped deeper under his coat. Darien's mind sharpened in an instant. No backup, no weapons, just instinct and training. He shifted his weight slightly, 1 foot forward, arms loose at his sides. This was not about brute force. It was about containment, timing, precision. He couldn't let this man, this puppeteer, reach the cockpit or deploy whatever tool he carried. Not now, not ever. His eyes locked onto the stranger's. The man's gaze was ice. And then he moved. But so did Darian. A single step forward.
No hesitación.
His arm rose just as the stranger's hand reached for the device, intercepting it mid-draw. Their arms tangled briefly in a tense, silent clash of leverage and power. The device slipped. It fell from the man's hand, clattering down the aisle, stopping just inches from a teenage passenger's shoe. Gasps rippled through the cabin again. The man froze. His plan had failed. Darian, still gripping his forearm, pushed him back one step, not with violence, but with control. The restraint of someone who had long mastered chaos without becoming it. Across the aisle, Corvin collapsed into his seat, watching with wide eyes, whispering. He wasn't supposed to bring the override. He wasn't supposed to bring it. The man stood frozen, the facade of control slipping. Darian didn't let go. They waited like that in silence, until the flashing lights outside the aircraft grew closer. The landing was over, but the battle for truth had only begun. The moment cracked open like a fault line. The man in row 12 stood, eyes narrowing at Darian Velen with a glare that sliced through the cabin's false sense of calm. No words of warning, no request, just that icy stare, as if offended by the mere act of being blocked. Darian didn't move. He didn't blink. The tension that had once rippled quietly now settled into every shoulder, every jawline, every breath across the aisle. It was no longer a flight. It was a standoff. "I need to proceed," the man said smoothly, his voice soft and toneless, like a well-rehearsed script meant to bypass emotion. "You're not going anywhere," Darian replied, voice low, calm, absolute. His stance widened slightly, feet anchoring to the carpet as if bracing for something worse than turbulence. The man tilted his head slightly, the flicker of irritation behind his gaze sharp as a scalpel. "I operate above standard authority," he said, almost with pity, like a parent correcting a child. "This emergency landing jeopardizes a refinement process years in the making." Passengers nearby turned their heads. The silence deepened. Darian's eyes dropped for a heartbeat, just long enough to spot it. A glint beneath the man's jacket. Metallic, small, unmistakably technological. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't regulation. It had ports, lines, polished grip. Something meant to interface, not communicate. Behind him, Varen whispered with a trembling breath. "That looks like the prototype. The one shown to crew years ago. The one we weren't supposed to ask questions about." Darian's mind moved fast. If the device was real, and if it worked the way rumors said, inducing panic, compliance, obedience, it could override more than just a landing procedure. Could manipulate a person, maybe even a crowd. "You can't deploy that," Darian said, tone dropping to a register meant only for the man. "Not here. Not on this plane." "I must," the man said. His eyes never left Darian's. "The exposure risk is too great." He wasn't supposed to trigger descent, he added, gesturing subtly toward Corvin without turning. "The subject's failure will be contained." Corvin's voice broke from the back, cracked and desperate. "Stop him, please. He trained me. He said there'd be no consequences. He said I'd pass the threshold." Darian's gut tightened. So it was true. Corvin wasn't just unstable, he was groomed, programmed, used. The man moved again, this time a half step forward, one hand casually brushing his jacket as if to readjust it, except Darian saw through the gesture. The other hand, hidden beneath the fold, was reaching. Darian surged forward with precision, intercepting the arm just as the man began to withdraw the device. He didn't punch. He didn't shove. He redirected. A redirection born from countless hours in executive crisis training. He locked the wrist with one hand, guided it downward with the other, applying just enough pressure to force a release. The device clattered to the floor, bounced once, and slid across the aisle. It stopped at the toe of a stunned passenger's shoe, blinking faintly. The entire cabin inhaled at once. The man's expression shattered. It wasn't rage, it was disbelief. For the first time, he saw Darian not as a passenger, not as a variable, but as a barrier. And barriers had to be neutralized. He twisted, tried to break free. Darien shifted his body, stepping in to absorb the momentum. With a forearm braced just below the shoulder, he locked the man in place, calm, immovable, absolute. "No more lies," Darien said under his breath. "No more testing people like subjects." The man struggled once more, but it was already too late. The weight of the moment had turned. Cameras were rolling. Witnesses were watching. The truth had a front row seat. The cockpit door remained closed, but a new voice crackled through the cabin speaker. Ground security was seconds away from boarding. The plane was still rolling, but the danger had already landed. And Darien didn't let go. Not until he felt boots stepping onto the aircraft floor behind him. The man who called himself untouchable was finally forced to face the truth. The cabin door swung open with a loud hiss, and within seconds, ground responders surged down the aisle in full tactical gear. Their black gloves moved fast, smooth and practiced, first securing Corvin Hale, who was still trembling and restrained near the galley wall, then moving on to the silent, unreadable man from row 12. The atmosphere cracked with a tension so thick that passengers forgot to breathe. Their phones now lowered, their voices hushed. The chaos of moments ago had frozen into something quieter, but heavier. Darien Vellon remained upright and composed, standing near the cockpit door with both sleeves rolled up slightly, revealing scratches he hadn't noticed until now. One of the responders glanced at him and nodded as if recognizing who had taken control before they even boarded. The responder closest to Corvin tightened the restraint around his wrist. But Corvin didn't resist. His fight was gone. Instead, his mouth fell open slightly as his eyes scanned the cabin in disorientation. "I didn't mean to. He told me this was for training," Corvin stammered, his voice hollow, not quite pleading but not defensive either. "He said I was chosen. Special." Darien stepped forward slowly, arms relaxed, gaze steady. "You were manipulated," he said calmly, voice even. "That much is clear now." Corvin blinked at him, eyes glistening with something between confusion and grief. I thought I was enforcing safety. I thought this was a simulation." One of the responders raised an eyebrow. "Simulation?" Corvin nodded faintly, lips quivering. "He said we were monitoring threshold compliance. Passengers who resisted protocols needed to be evaluated. He gave me these rules, scripts, told me who to watch, told me what to do if they pushed back." The man in row 12, now being restrained without a word, remained impassive, like a statue carved from arrogance. His name, confirmed moments later, was Drent Morick. The same Drent Morick who had once overseen internal evaluations at Altairjet, but had disappeared months ago after quiet rumors surfaced about unauthorized behavior modification trials. His eyes held no remorse as they met Darien's. Just an unsettling, calculated stare. A responder patted down Morick's coat and retrieved something from the inner lining, a slim, encrypted drive no bigger than a boarding pass. "We've got something," he said, handing it off to a federal agent with a flash badge. "Encrypted. Marked BAI. Behavioral Alignment Initiative," Darien muttered, remembering the phrase Corvin had blurted mid-flight. His instinct had been right all along. A second responder asked for Darien's full account. Darien gave it with composure, recounting every motion, every warning sign, every shift in body language he had tracked during the flight. Passengers nearby held out their phones, offering corroborating footage. Their stories aligned. The footage didn't lie. The truth was lining up cleanly except for the why. Varen, pale but standing tall beside Darien, took a breath and then confessed softly. "I remember Morick. He used to call some of us in for side instruction. Said it was part of a new elite compliance protocol. But we never saw paperwork. It was always off the record. When he vanished, I thought it ended." Darien turned slightly toward him. It didn't. Corvin, now seated and handcuffed, broke into a soft sob. "I thought I was protecting people. I didn't know it was real. I didn't know I was being used." One of the responders kneeled beside Darien. "Your call, Mr. Vellon. This guy, Corvin, wants a lawyer. We can take him in as a hostile actor or request mental evaluation under supervisory observation." Your testimony will sway the final classification. Darian didn't hesitate. Medical evaluation. He needs help, not punishment. He's a symptom, not the root. The responder gave a surprised glance, then nodded and signaled the others. Understood. Reclassifying Hale as compromised asset. Full psych evaluation to follow. As Morik was lifted and walked past Darian, his posture never broke. You disrupted years of work, he hissed under his breath, his tone almost clinical. Darian met his eyes with unwavering steadiness. Real authority protects people, not harms them, he replied. The passengers, exhausted and tense, broke into a quiet wave of applause. Not loud, not dramatic, but sincere. A lead investigator approached Darian with a tablet. We need you to remain on site for a formal statement. This isn't just about flight protocol anymore. It's a federal-level ethics violation. Your role was central. Darian nodded, eyes still following the responders as they led Morik off the aircraft and into the bright lights of the runway. The ordeal was not over, but the turning point had passed. And Darian, once merely a passenger with a goal, had become something far more important. The witness who exposed the silence. The truth behind the flight was finally stepping into the light. The moment Darian stepped into the private briefing room at Westford Terminal, the door shut behind him with a heavy, echoing click that seemed to seal the chaos of the flight into a tighter, more concentrated pressure. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a pale glow across the table where multiple screens displayed paused frames of the incident. Laren slept in a cushioned chair beside him, his small chest rising and falling peacefully despite the turmoil that had unfolded hours earlier. The contrast between the quiet child and the storm of evidence surrounding them made Darian's chest tighten with protective resolve. Across the table, 3 federal investigators sat with rigid posture, their eyes locked on the footage looping silently. One of them, Inspector Ryland Thorne, leaned forward and pressed play. The room filled with the muffled sounds of passengers gasping, Corvin's frantic voice, and the metallic crash of the beverage cart slamming against the galley wall. Darian watched the replay silently, his expression steady but his breath controlled, remembering each split-second decision that kept the passengers safe. Mr. Velen, Inspector Thorne finally said, his voice low with disbelief as he paused the footage again. You contained 2 separate threats without harming anyone. That level of control is extraordinary. His gaze moved from the screen to Darian, analyzing him with a mixture of respect and astonishment. Darian kept his voice calm. My priority was making sure no one got hurt. Panic would have made everything worse. Before the investigators could respond, the door opened abruptly. Jaron Redder, the regional airline leader, entered with a stiff smile plastered across his face. Gentlemen, he announced confidently, I'm sure we can resolve this quickly. It appears the situation was simply a misunderstanding. He froze when Inspector Thorne tapped a button, activating a smaller screen on the table. A close-up shot appeared, the device Morik attempted to deploy. Its metallic edges, lined with tiny ports, gleamed under the briefing room lights. Jaron's voice faltered. His smile vanished. Where did he get that? That's what we're trying to understand, Investigator Hale answered, folding his arms. And why it was used on a commercial flight without authorization. Dramatic irony pulsed through the room. Jaron had come in prepared to minimize the situation, only to be confronted with evidence that exposed the truth he hoped to avoid. Inspector Thorne turned to Darian. We cross-checked personnel history. The program Morik ran was never authorized by the airline's board. It was a rogue operation. He called it a hierarchical obedience metric. Passengers were being tested without consent. His tone darkened. This wasn't misconduct. This was experimentation. Laren stirred slightly in his chair, and Darian gently adjusted the blanket covering him before responding. Corvin mentioned being tested, conditioned. He believed he was following legitimate orders. And he was trained to believe that, Investigator Hale confirmed. False procedures, fake authority badges, fabricated protocols. The door opened again. Two medics escorted Corvin inside briefly. His hands trembled, and his voice was thin. "I didn't know. I thought it was real training," he whispered, eyes darting between Darian and the investigators. "He told me certain passengers could be evaluated. He said it would make me part of a higher program." Inspector Thorne gave a firm nod to the medics. "Take him to the stabilization unit. No further questions for now." As Corvin was led away, he looked at Darian with genuine remorse. Darian nodded back, not in forgiveness, but in understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that the man was more victim than villain. When the door closed again, Jaren stepped closer to Darian, his shoulders sagging under the weight of responsibility. "Mr. Velen," he said quietly, "may I speak with you privately?" Darian agreed with a single nod.
Jaren inhaled deeply.
"I failed to monitor Morik's department. I failed to prevent this."
I'm truly sorry.
His voice wavered slightly. "I understand if you pursue every possible action against us." Darian studied him for a moment, then replied, "Apologies matter only when followed by transparent action. This can't be buried." Before Jaren could respond, Inspector Thorne cleared his throat. "Mr. Velen, one more thing." He placed a folder on the table. "Given your leadership, your precision during the crisis, and your ability to de-escalate under pressure, we want your guidance." Darian looked up slowly. "Guidance? We're proposing a new passenger safety board," Thorne said. "We want you to advise on reforms. The airline will follow federal oversight. We need someone who understands both accountability and calm leadership." Darian leaned back slightly, the weight of the request settling on him. He knew what it meant: time, responsibility, public pressure. He glanced at Laren sleeping safely, the child who represented everything he fought to protect. After a long breath, he nodded. "I'll help," he said, voice steady, "but only if the reforms protect both passengers and vulnerable crew members." The investigators exchanged relieved looks, knowing the decision would shape aviation safety for years to come. The lights buzzed softly again as the room fell into a moment of stillness. One chapter closing, another beginning with greater stakes. This was no longer about one flight, it was about shaping the future of safety. The thunderclap of camera shutters filled the air the moment Darian stepped onto the stage.
No announcements. No prelude.
Just the blinding heat of lights and the weight of every eye in the media hall landing squarely on him, as if justice had taken human form. The backdrop bore the freshly printed name, the Velen Passenger Integrity Standard. The font was modern, clean, deceptively simple for what it stood for, a direct result of a 38,000-foot crisis that nearly detonated beneath polished smiles and pressed uniforms. Darian's gaze swept the room. Airline executives, federal oversight officials, investigative reporters, and a row of passengers from Flight 937 sat in tense reverence. Laren was in the front, legs swinging slightly, too young to know the full weight of what had happened, yet old enough to recognize that his father had changed something powerful. A moderator's voice cut through. "We now recognize Mr. Darian Velen for his role in guiding the integrity protocols that will redefine aviation passenger safety across this country." Polite applause rose, but Darian didn't smile. His face remained steady as he approached the podium, measured, deliberate, like every step on that flight. He gripped the edges of the lectern as if anchoring himself to the truth. "I didn't ask for this role," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But sometimes the only thing standing between harm and accountability is one decision not to stay silent." The crowd quieted. Behind them, digital screens played muted footage from the investigation. Corvin's erratic outbursts, Morik's calculated silence, and Darian stepping between chaos and control. Dramatic irony flickered in real time. The airline's president sat just left of center, smiling thinly, offering nods to the media as if these reforms were born of internal courage. Darian knew better. They all did. When the plaque was brought forward, etched with Darian's name beneath the program's official title, he accepted it with one hand and lowered his head slightly. Not out of pride, but out of solemn understanding. "This isn't a trophy," he said, turning it slowly. It's a reminder that unchecked systems will test us, and the most dangerous ones hide behind uniforms, badges, and scripted behavior. A flicker of discomfort passed across the executives' faces. That was the truth too few were ready to hear. After the speech, the event coordinator ushered Darian backstage. There, Varen waited nervously, now dressed in a new supervisor's uniform. The stripes were fresh, but his hands trembled. "They said my testimony sealed the case," Varen whispered.
No, Darian replied.
"Your courage did." Behind them, press statements were being distributed. One read, "Altairjet commits to transparency, integrity, and accountability across all crew protocols, effective immediately." The irony settled heavy in Darian's chest. He stepped into a quiet side hall where Corvin's name had appeared only once on the program, listed under crew under psychological remediation.
No slander. No blame.
Just a technical term designed to fade. But Darian hadn't forgotten. Corvin was undergoing therapy now, not punishment. Darian had insisted. "Fix the system," he'd told investigators. "But don't discard the broken unless you understand how they were bent." In a quiet interview room earlier that week, Corvin had barely looked up when Darian entered. But before he left, the former attendant had whispered, "Thank you for not letting me become just another headline." It echoed now, as Darian walked toward the exit of the media hall. Investigators trailed him, handing him early drafts of aviation reform proposals. One, still warm from the printer, bore the words, "National Passenger Ethics Initiative Draft 1. You were right about the deeper systems," one official said. "Other airlines have already requested access to the Velen standard." Darian nodded but didn't answer. Outside, the sun pierced the clouds with surprising clarity. Laren joined him, holding his hand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. At the threshold, Darian paused, his mind flashing back to that brief, brutal moment in row 3, where a knee had aimed to break him, and instead had unraveled something far bigger. He looked upward, not in gratitude, but in steady reminder. The day that nearly broke the sky instead reshaped the world beneath it. He struck and froze as the CEO stepped aside, sending him flying into the beverage cart, leaving the cabin in shock. If you believe true authority acts with precision and force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first and hardest. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.